Hey, how's it going, Matt?
Doing great.
Excellent. Really excited to have this conversation with you that's a bit more broad around how we think about UX, design, and all these things in the face of LLMs and working inside agentic coding tools. But before we get going, I'd love if you could just give us a quick introduction of you and what you do at Unblocked.
Yeah. So at Unblocked, I'm an engineer. I primarily work on the front end of Unblocked. So that means our web dashboard, all the kind of configuration UIs, our Mac app, our IDE plugins. I kind of work on all those. I do a little bit of other stuff kind of here and there, but that's really my focus.
That's awesome. I'm asking everybody at the beginning is what is context to you?
Right. I'll give kind of a simplistic answer at
Sure.
first. To me, context is really kind of an informed answer versus an uninformed answer. Maybe I'll give an illustration. In Unblocked, we have a module called the store proxy. It's kind of a bespoke part of the system. There's not a lot of equivalents outside of Unblocked, at least not directly. Let's imagine there's kind of a bug I have to fix in this module. Let's imagine CPU usage is really high. It doesn't work. Customers are running into this problem. So kind of an uninformed opinion might be if I were to go into some random GitHub project and ask someone random in GitHub, can you help me fix the bug in the store proxy? The CPU usage is really high. They're going to say, what are you talking about? I don't know what the store proxy is. If they're particularly helpful, they may say, high CPU usage. Have you considered there might be a loop where your code is doing the same thing over and over again? Which isn't incorrect answer, but it really doesn't take anything into account. An informed answer would be more like going to a senior engineer in the team and saying, hey, I've got this problem with the store proxy. The CPU usage is really high. Can you give me a hand with that? And they would be able to say something more like, oh, yes, we ran into problems like this a year ago. We found that sometimes the network calls or the database or whatever, something specific to that was a little bit high. You might want to check this class. Maybe this is something you could tackle. So it gives you a much more useful and helpful answer or way of tackling a problem when you have that kind of informed context.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you. So with that framing of like context being like informed and what it knows, like we've had a few conversations about some things. And one of those was you have a fun thesis that I like a lot on how engineers are evolving from basically being able to have total control over their stack to now allowing LLMs into the workflow, which means they're sort of ceding a little bit of that total control. So can you walk us through just like that thesis at a high level and like how you're thinking about it right now?
Yeah, for sure. So kind of as you said, historically, software engineers have had a lot of control, sometimes a control over almost every part of what they're working on. So if you have a project you're working on, as a software engineer, you would be able to have control over what language are you going to use,
Sure.
what database are you going to use, what library are you going to use? And then you kind of go down in scope a little bit and you're thinking more about what patterns is your team going to use, what code syntax or standards or whatever, what algorithms are approved, a whole bunch of things kind of at that level. And then you can go even down further and say, as an individual engineer, what color do I want the ID theme to be, or what command line app do I want to use, or shell or whatever. I think in our profession, we become very used to that. Over many years, engineers have learned to have that kind of control and be able to make decisions about these things. And we like to think through these problems. We like to exercise decision-making to solve a lot of these problems. And AI is one of the first times where we're being asked to cede some of that decision-making. Historically, before Prettier, teams would argue endlessly about code formatting, indenting a space after every semicolon or any of that. That took up a lot of mental energy. People would argue. People would leave PR comments constantly reminding each other, this doesn't match our format. And Prettier asked teams, effectively said, this is the deal. You cede control to us over this kind of question making, over this kind of decision making. We will make everything better. You will not have to think about this anymore. You won't have to waste time on it. The part of your brain that was taken up with that can be now reused for better things. Generally, teams love that. In retrospect, maybe people were scared about that a little bit. They didn't want to give that kind of control up. They didn't want to give up the decision making. But after they tried out, in retrospect, they say, yeah, I mean, I can't imagine having that kind of argument anymore.
Yeah,
Or
right.
like, you know, I'm on to better things. So similarly, AI is asking us to give up even more control, potentially. So I'm thinking more of like right now, the middle of that stack, where we're saying the exact code that you write, the exact, maybe the algorithm you choose to use,
Yeah.
maybe the class, you know, structure, you know, how these classes interact or these functions are called. As a first principle, you know, AI is saying you shouldn't need to worry about that as much anymore.
Yeah.
The bot is going to at least give you a first cut of these things. I think that can be a little bit in, you know, people have mixed feelings about that. Some people are really enthusiastic.
Yep.
They're like, I never cared about this in the first place. Let's go. But a lot of people, especially people who've been doing this, you know, been in this profession for a long time, can have mixed feelings. You know, they can feel threatened, feel very kind of ambivalent or very, you know, anxious about these things. And so I think this is just an interesting area. You know, it's where a lot of people's anxiety around this kind of whole area is about control. I think a little bit of letting go of the control that you used to have.
One thing that like we've connected on is we both like coffee a lot. And what's cool is you actually have your own coffee process that actually has quite a bit of control in terms of, I think you actually roast.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
It's really cool to see that expressed there. And then you balance things on the other side. And I feel like in, again, the broad discourse that I've seen around this is, yeah, it's people discussing those things and they even use coffee as an example.
And similarly, there's some people, you know, they're just happy to go to McDonald's and get a cup of coffee. They don't care.
Yeah. They're like, it's about caffeine.
Yeah, that's like the one extreme. Their extreme is maybe more like me, where it's like, you know, I'm not worried so much about control. It's, you know, it's a hobby for me.
Yeah.
I enjoy doing it. So, you know, I enjoy saying, yeah, I can roast the beans to exactly where I think, you know, like the coffee to be. I can grind it the way I want, etc.
But I mean, that makes a ton of sense. Like every once in a while, it's like, I do want to write every character of syntax, like for this whatever thing. And it's also cool because like, since you're working on the front end often, I think there's a level of precision there that's needed. And I don't know your experiences with these LLMs, but like they tend to miss the mark on like really detail oriented UI in my experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of bots, you know, they'll get the code kind of in the right place. They'll get code that maybe is, you know, usually logically correct. But once you get it up on the browser, it doesn't look like it's supposed to look. So, and I guess this kind of goes back to, you know, to some level of control, at least today, you might be able to kind of cede some control to a bot to generate some of your code. And even if you look at it, it might look correct. But ultimately, you know, when I use these AI tools, I'm on the hook for anything I commit. You know, anything I push to get, any commits I make, I'm on the hook for that. I'm on the hook for fixing it. I'm on the hook for making sure it is correct.
Yeah.
I'm on the hook for future bugs. If something goes wrong, I need to understand the code. So, you know, there's still a very broad area of control where I want to be happy with what goes in. I want to make sure it works, like it looks correct in the browser. And I do need to understand it so that inevitably when the bugs come, when there are problems, I need to be able to dig in there and actually fix it. And if I don't understand it, that's going to be a big problem.
Yeah. I mean, one fun example is I was working on a personal website and I thought to myself, I was like, oh, I need to be ready for different screen sizes or resolutions. So I like told my agent, I was like, hey, be ready for different screen size resolutions. So what it did is make a list of every screen size breakpoint and like put it in.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't think this is the elegant approach.
Yeah. And that's fine. Like sometimes I'll use these tools just for spitballing.
For sure.
You know, like I'll say, okay, I know you're probably not going to get it right because the UI is super complicated or something like that. But it helps me get started. It gives me a framework to work in. And then I can go on to like narrower things and give a bot more guidance on certain parts of it that need to be, you know, tuned in different ways.
I'd love to pull that out a little more. Like when you're working in these tools and messing with an agent, at what level of control are you giving up? Or is it like you just mentioned, oh, I'm prototyping right now, so let's mess around. Let's go see what I can throw out code.
Yeah.
And then when it's coming to this is going to go in a actual PR, like how are you working with the machine, I guess, is the way I'm thinking of it.
It really depends on what kind of task I'm trying to do. Yeah. My approach is a little different depending on things. So let's imagine it's like a fairly substantial feature, something I'm trying to add. I will first ask a bot to kind of make a plan. This is a pretty typical approach, I think. I'll get the bot to kind of list out how, you know, different options for how to implement it. I'll maybe ask it to generate some code for different parts of it. But I try to start at a very high level and then refine each part of it. You know, usually if I start by just asking a bot, implement this feature for me, even if I give it a lot of detail, it's going to fall over pretty quickly is my experience, even if I've configured and tuned the bot and the model to what I think is best. And that's fine. I can still get it to do a high level task, a high level kind of plan, and then work down to each of those things. Usually I'll get to a point where I need to step in and start writing code, start rearranging things so kind of I understand it better. And I think for the future kind of architecture or whatever, it probably will work a bit better. But I'll still use bots to fill in some of the gaps. So like the classic example is unit tests.
Right.
Once I have the code in a space where I think it runs reasonably, it's pretty close to what I want, I'll just ask it, write me the unit tests. But even then, it'll generate unit tests that aren't logically the things that I think need to be in the test to actually verify the correct behavior. So I'll still have to go through and generally look at the tests and then say, oh, actually, this one, you're missing this logical kind of constraint or this behavior that we need to verify for the unit test to actually work correctly. So it's really and the big picture is, start at the top level, ask for the big picture thing, then narrow it down. And at some point, I usually have to step in and kind of finish things off.
And of course, being here at Unblocked, a context company, at what parts of this sort of like work down, I guess, like that you're doing? Are you like inputting like context so that it can obviously reason better about it or like improve its output?
Yeah. So it does depend on the task a little bit.
Sure.
Sometimes really big projects, I'll have to kind of get my head in the right space. I'll have to understand kind of where we've been in this kind of a project. Or if I'm fixing a bug, I may need some historic context. So often I'll just go to Unblocked first and ask some general questions just to get my head in the right space and understand some of the historic context of how we got to this point. Sometimes when I then go to an IDE and start asking bots, can you implement this, or can you change this, I don't know, unit test in this way?
Sure.
I'll instruct the bot, using our MCP tooling to get more context for a reason. Because, sometimes I'll see some code in there and I'll be like, I don't know, what's the deal with this?
Yeah.
And, I could open up Git and go way back in history and kind of manually cobble together anything, or I could highlight it and not only get the code, the Git history, but I get a sense of what were the Slack conversations that actually led to this decision for this weird code that I don't get. There's a lot of tying together of different contexts that can work quite well in that way. And then, of course, after all that happens, I get my code in the shape that I want it to be in. I'm happy with my PR. The code review bot will then kind of help me wrap things up. Usually tell me when I've done something wrong, but what it's telling me is very high impact stuff where I have gotten something logically wrong, not nitpicky stuff.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I actually really like that. As I think through what you were just mentioning, like if you're in your IDE and you highlight a code block, let's say, because you're like, what is this or whatever, it's Kotlin. It's both giving you context, like Unblocked serving you in this moment, and it's potentially serving the agent that you're working with, like if you've asked it to like run with this information. And I find that it's kind of beautiful in a way that you're sort of like working in tandem with the LLM, like you're gaining context, it's gaining context. And like, do you think that this is the way that we will proceed as engineers, like forward? This is likely what will keep happening. Is I'm going to call it symbiotic instead of parasitic, I guess.
Yeah,
like,
Let's use the more positive term.
Exactly. Like it's like, how do you see that moving forward? And have you enjoyed this?
Yeah, I have enjoyed it. Part of that is, exploratory. This is such a new space and a new area, and every week there's something new to try out. So it's kind of neat from a novelty standpoint, at least initially. And then you start thinking as an engineer, which of these things are worth using, which of these things will benefit me. The symbiotic question, that's interesting because, I think that's actually for the foreseeable future anyway, that kind of makes what I think has the biggest impact. You still get the judgment and the kind of understanding from a person, and you get all of the kind of speed and spitball kind of idea generation and all the other capabilities and built-in tools that AI tools can give you. Sometimes... Well, a lot of times the, AI enthusiasts will say, oh, no, you don't even need to think about that. Just tell the bot what you want.
Yeah.
And in 2 lines, they'll go and build you everything. And then you can go have a coffee or something. I see where they're getting at, but that's not the space we're in right now, as far as I can tell. You never know where it's going to go. Maybe they're right, but I tend to think this could go in a variety of directions, this whole space. I'm focusing on the now, the kind of symbiotic. Yeah, you give me ideas. I think about them. We work together to kind of get to a solution. It makes a lot of sense to me.
Part of what we were chatting about is like obviously going back, like there's the symbiotic relationship, like there's control. We talked through how engineers are very used to a lot of control, let's be real. And now there's ceding parts of it. What I'm interested in is where in your current workflow are you giving up the most control, you think, from what you were historically like in an engineering workflow? And where would you like to give up more control if you could, but don't trust it yet?
Yeah, that's a good question. Where am I giving up control right now? I guess as a theme in my career, I'm happy giving up control for things that I'm pretty convinced I either don't care about or I most likely shouldn't care about. As much as we all loved having those debates about tabs versus spaces, I'm glad Prettier jumped into that gap and means that I never have to think about that again. There's a lot of kind of low level stuff that I really don't want to think about anymore. I'm happy to hand off a bunch of the work about idea generation, framing, generating kind of a skeleton for what I want to do. Boring stuff, like unit tests. Nobody likes writing unit tests. A lot of those are, I'll verify the output. I do need to keep control over the end output, but I'm happy to explore that space,
Yeah.
And I think that's probably where things will be for the next kind of indefinite future as this whole space evolves.
Yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense. And one thing that's fun, we had a good debate about this, I think, a few times in the office, and I definitely want to do it here, is why do you think people still want model selection as an option in whatever tool they're using?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'll pick a tool, VS Code, just as an example.
Yep.
So, VS Code, Copilot, all these tools, you open them up, there's a chat box or something. And then at the bottom, there's a model selector.
Yep.
I think the motivation for this, at least from a user point of view, is they've tried to do some task. They've instructed the bot to do something. They feel the bot failed.
Yep.
So now they're going to change the model and see if that gets any better. So it feels a little bit like, the approach where you don't really know what will be the best result. So you're just going to try a whole bunch of things. It's kind of spitballing, which is okay for what it's worth. We're in a very nascent place. You'll notice that in Unblocked, we actually, don't have that. At the very bottom, there is no model selector. Our philosophy in terms of building user interfaces is largely to only expose things where we have a pretty solid conviction that they'll actually help people.
Yeah.
So for this particular example, it felt a bit disingenuous to expose the model selector to users. And the reason for that is it kind of means you don't really know what the best model is for a given workflow. So in this exact case, in Unblocked, we've got a bunch of workflows, a bunch of different tasks that we do kind of internally. We could say, hey, you pick the model and hopefully it works out. But we've done a lot of research for each of these workflows. We think we figured out for each workflow what's a good model to use for each one of these things. And so we're just going to go ahead and use it. If we'd asked each user to kind of pick, well, A, we're pretty convinced the end result wouldn't be as good. But B, we're kind of asking each user, do the research. For every one of these tasks, why don't you do the research? Why don't you explore and learn about each of these models and try all of them out for every single thing? And hopefully you get the best end result. And by the way, everyone on the team has to do that separately because everyone's got a different model picker, whatnot. That doesn't seem like the best UI. It feels like for now, because we're in a very nascent state in this industry, it's kind of what is the default. I think for me, a little bit, it feels as if, when you're in VS Code, if VS Code had a drop down and was asking you, what database should VS Code use? You'd think, well, that's a bizarre question. Why should I care about the database? I mean, you all in the VS Code team, you're the experts on VS Code. You know what you need. You built the thing. Why don't you pick the database?
Yeah.
So similarly, I think in the future, in retrospect, people are going to think, why did we let people pick, a model?
Yeah.
I think that's an evolutionary dead end. I think it'll disappear eventually.
For sure. Cause I also think about when GPT 5.2 drops, does everyone at the company put their hands down and be like, oh, gotta go.
Right. Yeah. No. Not only are you, is Microsoft effectively, but they're like forevermore, whenever there's another model.
Every time.
And there's a model that comes up, by the way, every few days. Why don't you do a whole bunch more research on every workflow and figure out, is this better or worse than what you had before?
I mean, I'm willing to cede this control. Let's just say I'll take that.
Oh yeah. No, I don't want to think about those things at all.
Another thing that I'm curious about is just how do you think about UX when it comes to this, frankly, the proliferation of a chat box and LLM clients? It's pretty much what it is. It's how you interact. Maybe an API call.
Yeah, it is the standard right now. I do think, it was a great way to start with this. It's kind of nice because, again, in the sense of control, it's, here's a box where you can kind of put in anything. You can kind of ask anything. You can get any task defined. So I think it's good for what it is, but I think it is a very nascent thing. It's a good place for the industry to have started. I do think it could be seen as an evolutionary dead end eventually. I think a lot of tools, a lot of AI tools are going to evolve to the point where they have more targeted workflows for different tasks that are relevant to software engineers. One thing that's interesting and kind of shows how this may go is Cursor recently released a new version where they've added effectively kind of a UI editor.
Right.
So they'll show, it opens up kind of a little browser thing with your product in it, and you can kind of drag and drop bits and pieces of your UI, and then the bot gives you effectively suggestions or a work plan of how you can actually change the UI in the way that you've kind of done by dragging and dropping things around. I think it's an interesting example. It kind of makes sense to me of kind of a nice thing that is a much more tuned and useful workflow for certain tasks.
I feel like we're going to keep seeing these evolutions because one of them to me is like, as much as it's still a chat box for the input, but I find fascinating is I think Cursor has it as agent mode now, but it started with Conductor, I think did this, but basically they were like, let's take Git work trees and you can send the prompt, let's say one prompt, but it will build like 6 versions on 6 Git work tree. Right. Like, here's your 6 prototypes. Like, which one do you like, I guess?
Yeah. That's an interesting thing. I mean, as a side note, nobody knew about Git work trees really before this whole thing. And now every AI tool is using it. And so people are like, guess I got to learn about Git work trees.
It's great.
Yeah. I mean, it's also an interesting thing because one tool came up with the idea of doing this. And now almost every AI kind of chat tool has this kind of workflow. I think it's interesting. There's going to be a ton of iteration in this space about every kind of idea like this. It's an interesting space where, again, these tools are giving you a whole bunch of ideas, but in this case, they're actually you're not so much ceding control. They're like, here's 6 different ways of doing this.
Yeah.
There's kind of a symbiotic, okay, now you use your judgment to figure out which of these is actually probably the best moving forward, both for you and your team.
It's important to do so. And when I think about like with Unblocked and the way that our context engine functions to like really help engineers like get the right information up front to be, for me, what I've noticed is the velocity of I need to do a thing to, let's call it PR ready. And now we also have code review, so we're helping there too. But like that velocity is much faster with Unblocked in the picture is like what I've seen. And I feel like I've also seen more acceptance of like the code suggestions just in like watching users use our product. So I'm curious about how people, as we get better context engines, may be more willing to give up control of little bits of like this workflow. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's definitely an area where there's more trust building.
Right.
People use some of these tools and without the right context, understandably, the tool doesn't do very well. Yeah. The agent falls over or gives a bad suggestion on how to solve some task. Yeah. And that erodes trust that an engineer would probably look at the output and be like, well, this bot's useless. With more context, every bit of relevant context that you provide improves the bot's ability to make good decisions, to make informed decisions, especially with Unblocked, where we can provide context that's been kind of prepared for a bot in particular, that can make a big difference. I think that is an arc where the more context you have and the more it's provided in a way that's tuned for a bot, the better. The converse of that is in VS Code or most of these tools. If you ask an agent for a task, you have to provide all the context. You can drag files in there, but you have to manually do it. Sometimes they'll find the right context or a few things, but it's not a great experience. It's very manual. There's a lot of cognitive overhead in having to prepare that beforehand. Whereas with Unblocked, we can kind of do a lot of that lifting for you and take that cognitive overhead and you can use that for other, use that brain power for other things.
Yeah. It's fun because one thing that's happened in like conversations with my friends, a lot of them, their teams like deploy some agentic coding tool like across the Eng org. They're like, you're all in Cursor, you're all in Cloud Code. Here's a license, like have fun, burn tokens or whatever. But then they don't see the gains of, engineering output that they read that other companies are getting, and they're wondering why. And what I found is like, it's actually this context is what unlocks that for them, is like the way they curated, the way they think about it. And it's fun because in this conversation, as we've gone through just like the idea of control and like seeding it and stuff, like I think that might be one of the big sticking points, is because these engineers don't want to give up control, to your point. So it's fun that I've seen some of our customers who have rolled out whatever, GitHub Copilot across the org, but they haven't seen adoption. And then when they introduce Unblocked, it's like suddenly there's like an increase in adoption and a virtuous cycle basically
Yeah.
spawns, which is great to see.
Another example of that is code review. The code review, a lot of code review tools, there's so many of them now.
For sure.
But a lot of the code review tools that are kind of out there and gaining some traction are, you put up a PR and they don't give you a helpful code review. They nitpick everything. It's like having another engineer over your shoulder just tapping you and saying, you didn't use the approved pattern for this or whatever. Yeah. And that erodes trust as well. That feels bad as a professional. It's like, well, that's a lower order kind of problem that I don't need to deal with. What we've really tried to do with Unblocked Code Review is make it so that the feedback is great and that improves trust. That really helps people say, oh yeah, a bot can be really helpful because it helped me solve a very particular problem. So that kind of goes along with this symbiotic relationship with trust, all that kind of stuff.
And so we've talked through quite a few things about how you think about the space and other challenges when it comes to working with these systems. I'm curious about like how our various product surfaces that we've designed, because like we try to meet the developer where they are in that workflow, depending on what they're trying to get done. Like how are these various product surface areas designed to help them actually get their job done? Because we seem to care a lot about that at Unblocked. It's not just like, here's a fun thing, have a good time. It's like, you have a job to do, and I respect that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we put a lot of work into our user interfaces, into designing workflows. We're very deliberate about that. And I think, it comes from a place of kind of respect for the user. We don't want people to feel frustrated using the tool. We want the experience to be really great. And, there's a few spaces where we put a lot of effort into that. Some example, our philosophy is, I mentioned this earlier, we really want to minimize the amount of clutter. So like you'll notice in Unblocked, a lot of the UIs are pretty minimal, isn't quite the right word, but they're very sculpted for particular workflows to help people accomplish very particular things without a ton of clutter in there. When you ask a question in the Unblocked web user interface, there aren't really a lot of buttons. There's a small number of them where we think, yeah, this would actually be really useful and give meaningfully different results when people need them. But generally, it's very simple. It's ask a question, get an answer. And that's the same kind of philosophy we use just about everywhere. So like our MCP tools are meant to kind of fit seamlessly into other existing tools. So like you use Cursor, there's not really much configuration you have to do. You just kind of get the uplift seamlessly. Our administrative UIs are meant to make sure that the administrator setting them up, does one bit of work and then everyone else on the team doesn't have to do anything like that. It's not like setting up a local ID or something. You plug in our MCP tools and you get all the benefit of what the administrator has set up.
What's fun to me is as I went through and explored, obviously using our product in many different ways, is there's one area where we do let the user set a user level preference, which is basically the type of response they get from Unblocked, which can be essentially concise. We of course have defaults, and then verbose. So like typically it's like be technical. And I actually love that because often when I'm working with Unblocked in the way of like, I'm like trying to understand our system, like I want long technical, like detailed answers. So like, how did we settle on that decision?
Part of that comes from a place of we're not sure that there are people who use Unblocked from different backgrounds.
For sure.
So if you're an engineer, you're more likely to want to change that setting to be, technical and detailed.
Yeah.
And that gets you answers that are really meaningful as an engineer, where it's quite verbose. It'll give you lots of references, lots of detail for every reference. This is why it's important, all that kind of stuff. And it uses technical language, which is appropriate. But we have customers who are more, product managers. They don't need a technical answer when they ask a question. They need a more conceptual answer. And so you can kind of crank that thing down a little bit to get the kind of answer you want. And maybe you don't need as much detail. You just want kind of a primer on things. We found that that was one area where we did really need to allow some control over the answer because we couldn't predict who a person was and we couldn't predict exactly what kind of thing they were trying to do.
Well, thank you so much for walking me through it. This has been super fun. I really enjoyed the conversation and the way that you're thinking about this. To me, it clearly shows that we just care a lot about the user.
This was a great conversation. Thank you very much.
Of course. Thanks, Matt.